Good evening and welcome. My name is Stephanie Fassler. I am the Vice President of Operations and International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Ambassador Series program. Many thanks to our strategic partners, the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, for the use of this beautiful venue to host our public programs. These are being filmed for our YouTube channel, and the video will be made available within 24 hours of the event. We welcome this evening His Excellency Daniel Mulhall, Ambassador of Ireland to the United States. We will look at a variety of topics, including the impact of Brexit on Ireland and the U.S.-Irish bilateral relationship. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 made Ireland a self-governing dominion under the British Commonwealth until in 1948, when it became an independent with the Ireland Act. In 1987, Ireland joined the European Union, and in 1999 entered the Eurozone currency union. In 1998, the United States and Irish governments worked together to negotiate the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland that brokered peace between the Catholic and Protestant communities. More recently, Ireland has seen the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015 by popular referendum, and voted in May 2018 to repeal its Constitution's 8th Amendment, clearing the way for the legalization of abortion. Ambassador Mulhall is the 18th Ambassador of Ireland to the United States, taking up the post in August 2017. A 40-year veteran of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Mulhall has been Counselor of the Press Division of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Secretary of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, Director General of European Affairs, and has served as Irish Ambassador to Malaysia, Germany, and Great Britain. Our discussant this evening, Honorable Jim Moran, is the co-chair of the WAC-DC Board of Directors. He's a senior legislative advisor at McDermott, Will & Emery, and a former U.S. representative for Virginia's 8th Congressional District, having served 12 terms. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Mulhall and Congressman Moran.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the World Affairs Council for the invitation to speak to you this evening, and thank you all for coming out on this warm evening when you might want to be sunning yourself in the garden or having a swim or something like that, or going for a walk down along the Potomac. Anyway, thank you for coming. It's good to see such a group here this evening. I've been 10 months now in the United States, and I have really enjoyed the experience of being here. It's a great pleasure to be Ireland's ambassador anywhere in the world, but it's a particular privilege and honor to be Ireland's ambassador in a country where the Irish connections are so strong and so enduring. So there are a number of reasons why I have found my posting here in the United States to be particularly enjoyable and memorable. The first is that I've always been an admirer of the United States ever since I came here as a J1 student in 1974. So anyone who thinks about getting rid of that program, they'll have to answer to me about it. So I advise you to encourage your congressmen and senators to ensure that the program keeps going, because it did give me a lifelong interest in the United States. And you know, when I was told last March 2017, that I would be coming to the United States in the summer period in August of last year, I said to myself, well, I better have a look at my bookshelf and see where I can find books that I might have on the United States. And I went around. I discovered I had quite a library of books on the United States. So I think I've been kind of preparing for this assignment quietly over the last 40 years, and I've accumulated all these books. But it goes back to really the experience of living in the United States, living in Kansas City. You'd probably be surprised to discover that an Irishman made it all the way to Kansas City in 1974, but there you are. That was my experience. My first experience of America was in Kansas City. I look forward to going back there and revisiting the places that I remember visiting as a student in 1974 when I spent about 2.5 months in the United States. So the second reason why I find the assignment here so interesting is because it gives an opportunity to understand the dynamics of American society. America is the most important country in the world, but I think it can often be misunderstood, and therefore I've been really felt quite keen to get out and about. And in the last 10 months, I think I've done about 40 separate trips all over this country. And what I've discovered is the great variety, the great diversity of the United States. It's not just a question of, the two coasts and the center, or north and south, or urban, rural. Every part of the United States that I've visited so far has its own particular dynamic, its own particular personality. Many of your cities, even ones that wouldn't be regarded as top-tier cities, in other countries could be capital cities because they have the fabric, they have the wherewithal, they have the cultural and institutional base that you normally associate with capital cities. So I've been very interested to discover the diversity of the United States. And of course, the third reason why I have really enjoyed being here is because it has allowed me to engage with Irish America, which is a great asset to Ireland. The fact that so many people in this country feel an affinity to Ireland is a huge advantage for our country. We have less than 5 million people in the Irish state, another 1.5 million or so in Northern Ireland. So we're a small country by any standard. And yet, in this country, we have maybe 35 or more million people who identify with Ireland, who recognize themselves as having an Irish background, and who have some sense of an affinity with Ireland. And that seems to continue across the generations. I recently had the privilege of hosting an event for the Kennedy family on the 50th anniversary of the death of Robert Kennedy. And I was honored to be invited to speak at Arlington Cemetery and to read from one of Robert Kennedy's speeches, and then to host the family and their chief guests at our residence afterwards for a reception, for a lunch. And that struck me as a sign of the fact that a family like the Kennedys, as iconic and as central to the modern American experience as any other family in this country, even though their ancestor, Patrick Kennedy, left my part of Ireland in 1848, all those generations later, they still look to come to the Irish Embassy to engage the Irish Embassy in this important milestone commemoration of Robert Kennedy. So that, I think, is part of why I found this posting to be so intriguing, to be so enjoyable, and why I'm really looking forward to every day that I will spend here during my term as ambassador to this country. Ireland's going through an interesting time at the moment. Our country has been transformed by, I guess, economic development and a certain social evolution that's occurred on the back of that economic development. When I tell you that a country like Ireland, that was for centuries a byword for underachievement, a country associated with the reality of emigration, because from the great famine of the 1840s until fairly recent times, the Irish have been perpetual emigrants. They have emigrated to different countries around the world. And in the last 15 years, we have become a nation of immigrants. And it probably will surprise you to find that today in Ireland, 1 in every 6 people in our population was born outside our state. So we have now become a magnet for people from other parts of Europe and beyond, in the way that the United States was in decades and centuries gone by, and still is to some extent. So that's a real transformation of our demographic circumstances. And the positive news from Ireland in that regard is that Irish people seem to have taken fairly easily and fairly smoothly to this transformation of our country from a country of emigration where the foreign population in Ireland 30 years ago was minuscule to a time when now we have proportionately maybe the fourth largest population of immigrants, of people from outside the country in Ireland. So we're fourth among the European countries now in terms of the percentage of our population that were born outside the state. So, and I'm happy to say that Irish people appear to be quite relaxed about these changes. And the kind of angst that you find in other parts of the world about immigration and identity issues and globalization and economic change doesn't seem to have yet got a grip on Irish people, who dealt, after all, with a severe economic downturn 10 years ago and recovered from it without resorting to populist policies or anti-immigrant sentiments. And I think that's probably a byproduct of the fact that in our minds, we Irish still think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants. We know that for centuries and generations, Irish people were met with hostility and suspicion in other parts of the world, including in America, by the way. And we don't want to fall into the same trap of putting the blame on immigrants and people from outside of Ireland for whatever difficulties we may have. So despite the fact that we had a massive economic shock in 2008, 2009, this response, this populist response, never became a fact of life in Ireland, but it did elsewhere in the European Union and beyond. So at the moment, our economy is doing very well. We've had the fastest growing economy in Europe for the last 4 years, and our prospects going forward are very positive. And part of that economic transformation in Ireland, which has also led to changed attitudes and a more open and tolerant approach to things, reflected in the recent referendum results on marriage equality and indeed on the Eighth Amendment on the right to life. Irish people, to their credit, have responded well to the challenges of economic and social change. I'm not saying that'll be the case forever, by the way, because there's no guarantees of anything. But so far, to date at least, we've had a good experience, and we haven't seen the rise of anti-immigrant nationalism or populism in Ireland in a way that has occurred elsewhere in Europe. So that transformation of our economy has a lot to do with our connections with the United States. Our links with the United States, of course, go back to the 18th century and even earlier. But in particular, in the 19th century, there was a surge of immigration from Ireland to the United States, which created this community of Irish birth and descent in this country, which has played a major role in the affairs of Ireland. Because in the 19th century, the Irish Americans maintained their interest in Irish affairs, and they sought to support various political movements in Ireland. And probably Ireland would not have achieved its independence when it did in 1922 had it not been for the support that came from Irish America in the decades leading up to our revolutionary period. And then in the 20th century, and in particular since 1960, we've seen a great economic impact, American economic impact on Ireland, where American firms started to invest in Ireland, started to build businesses in Ireland, to employ people there. And today, we have about 700 plus US multinationals who have bases in Ireland and who employ between them 150,000 Irish people, or about 7% of our total workforce. And this has had a transformative effect on Ireland, because not only have those companies done well in Ireland, they've succeeded in Ireland, they've contributed hugely to our economy, but they've also spun out other companies. So typically an Irish person working for an American multinational in years gone by, after a certain number of years working with the American parent company, would have set up their own company using the experience they gained working for the American company, and then that company grows separately. So not only have American companies had a direct effect on Ireland, but they've had an indirect effect in creating a whole generation of entrepreneurial individuals in Ireland who have established their own companies and growing those companies internationally. And now, ironically, the trend is reversed, whereby now there's as much investment coming from Ireland to the United States as there is from the United States to Ireland. So about 500 Irish companies currently have investments in this country, and between them, they employ about 100,000 Americans. So it's a really interesting story of how an economic relationship that at one stage was very much Ireland being dependent on US investment is now a two-way street, whereby investment is flowing in both directions, as is trade. So our situation is very positive at the moment, as I say. But there is a cloud on the horizon, and that cloud is Brexit. We didn't want Britain to leave the European Union. We hoped they wouldn't do so. We were disappointed with the result of the referendum. But of course, we recognise that Britain is entitled to make its own decisions. And we now have to cope with the implications of our nearest neighbour leaving the European Union. And those implications are essentially in two categories. The first is the implications for Northern Ireland, for the peace process, for the open border that we currently enjoy between North and Southern Ireland. And the second is the overall economic relationship between Ireland and Britain, which is vital from an Irish point of view. And our aim is to keep that border open, invisible, not to allow any hardening of that border, because that would be a blow to the communities that live on that border, to both parts of Ireland, and indirectly to the peace process. And our European partners have been very supportive of Ireland. They've stood foursquare behind us, and they have backed our demand that there should be no border on the island of Ireland. The British government has also signed up to the same principle of no border in Ireland. The crunch now comes as we try to give effect to those commitments. In December of last year, the British government agreed to a political declaration which said that they would take the necessary action to ensure that there would never be a border on the island of Ireland. We're now trying to turn those political commitments into legally binding documents, and that's creating a certain amount of tension. We haven't yet got a solution to that problem. But we will insist that whatever happens, there can be no border on the island of Ireland. We will also want the closest possible future relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom, because we're a country with a strong connection with the UK. It's one of our most important markets. And therefore, anything that hinders the flow of trade between Europe and the United Kingdom would be particularly difficult from an Irish point of view. So we have to insist on turning those commitments about the border into legally binding language. We also then have to push hard to ensure that the relationship between the UK and the EU is as close as it possibly can be, given that the UK will be outside the European Union. And the other cloud on our horizon is the fact that we now see signs of trade tensions developing between the United States and the European Union. So far, the tariffs that have been imposed by both sides are relatively modest, but this is a bad sign, because for Ireland, free trade is an absolute essential ingredient for our future success. And therefore, we do worry when we see signs of a growing trade tension across the Atlantic. And we will be on the side of those trying to find ways of avoiding those tensions escalating, because nobody can gain from a trade war. Nobody wins trade wars. They're lose-lose situations, sadly. and therefore we do everything we can to make the case for free flows of trade and investment. That's the best way in which to ensure prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic for Ireland and for the United States. Thank you very much.
Well, that was articulate and comprehensive,
Thank you.
unfortunately, because it basically covered every issue I was going to ask of you. But since I went to a little bit of effort in putting some questions together, I'm going to ask them anyway.
You get different answers anyway, it's okay.
Oh, we'll see. But I shouldn't be surprised that it was as fine a presentation. And we want to thank all of you for coming. The ambassador has a great many things to do. The fact that he chose to share some time with us this evening is a credit to the World Affairs Council and to all of you who attend these sessions. So we really do thank you for being here. So Daniel Mulhall is a learned man. He has specialized in modern Irish history. He graduated from the University of College in County Cork with a master's degree 40 years ago. I mention that because you look a lot younger than you actually are. He immediately joined Ireland's Foreign Service, and within about a year, he was sent to one of the most populous countries in the world, to India. And then he became ambassador to Malaysia and Southeast Asia before being assigned to the European Union. And then, of course, he got some of the most prestigious appointments to Germany and to London. So he's a big deal. And it reflects well on our country that the Irish government chose to send him here. We have had some very fine ambassadors. Anne was wonderful.
Absolutely, my predecessor,
delightful.
yes, indeed.
So they're not big shoes because she didn't have big feet, but so we won't use that analogy. But she's a tough act to follow. That would be and yet we know you're going to do this. This is a difficult time to be assigned to represent Ireland when Ireland is moving forward at such a rapid rate, not so much the United States. But you're also part of the Irish government's delegation to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. He's written 2 books, and we would recommend you buying them. In fact, if some of you would put them up, request them on Amazon, it would get them moving again. You're too modest to suggest that, but I would ask of you to do that because you're all quite learned yourselves. So he wrote a book called A New Day Dawning. A New Day Dawning. It's a portrait of Ireland in 1900. So I mentioned that he was a scholar of modern Irish history, and this shows kind of the foundation from which Ireland has grown. And then he wrote a book called The Shaping of Modern Ireland. So any of you who are truly interested in understanding where Ireland is coming from and getting a better sense of where it's going should really read those books. So I'm serious about plugging them, and those of you who are scholarly, you really ought to order them wherever you. I'm not sure they have them at bookstores because there aren't many bookstores left, but Amazon, wherever. So, Mr. Ambassador, much of our nation's attention is currently focused on immigration and trade. The Congress yesterday rejected immigration reform, and the Supreme Court just held up what has been called the Muslim ban. So this means that the president will continue to drive the debate and interpret the law as he chooses, without much interference from the legislative or judicial branch of government. I'd like for you to tell us, if you would, how this might affect the thousands of Irish residents without documentation who are currently living in America today.
Yes, well, of course, we have a long history of immigration to this country, and sadly there are a number of Irish people who find themselves in the situation of being undocumented. These are people who came here in more innocent times, I would say, people who maybe never really thought they were moving to America. They were just offered a job in a bar in New York or by a construction company owned by an Irish person in Boston or Chicago or whatever. And
Well,
kind of
since they put in that new law where you lose your driver's license if you're caught DUI, and the last time I was in Ireland, I was in the line going back to the U.S., and there were 2 or 3 men who were coming to the U.S. to be bartenders because the pubs were closing down. I don't know whether that was a trend, but I welcome them, obviously.
I was thinking more of these people, the people I'm talking about who are undocumented have been in the United States for probably 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Many of them have now established businesses of their own. They have families and so on, and therefore they're in a difficult position. But we've been trying to find ways of dealing with their situation. But of course, we recognize the fact that immigration in this country has become a very, very hot topic and has become increasingly difficult and fraught. And therefore, that has not helped in finding a solution for this small number of Irish people who are in this predicament. Of course, the United States is not the only country in the world where these issues are currently creating waves. In Europe, not in Ireland, as I said, Ireland is, at the moment at least, free of this kind of anxiety about immigration. But all across Europe, the issue of migration is creating considerable difficulty. And today, the European Council, the heads of government and of the European Union countries are meeting in Brussels, and the big item on their agenda is not Brexit or the United States' relationship with Europe, but rather migration and how to deal with the issues that arise when large numbers of people from North Africa, Syria, and from further south move into Europe. How do you deal with that situation? And it has created a lot of upheaval. As I say, in Ireland, we are currently not affected by those kind of debates that are raging elsewhere in Europe, but it's something that is certainly not unique to the United States. So when I look at the debate here in the United States on immigration, I understand it because I've seen debates of a similar kind in other parts of Europe. And indeed, one of the factors that caused the Brexit vote to go the way it did was a resistance to immigration in Britain and a feeling that somehow by leaving the European Union, Britain would be able to control or eliminate the migration of people into the UK. Now, whether that happens or not is an open question. I'm skeptical because Britain, like other countries, needs immigrants to do jobs that are not otherwise going to be done. And if the economy is going to continue to prosper, it does need to bring in a certain number of people. So I'm not sure that goal of reducing immigration will be actually achieved through Brexit, but it was certainly one of the things that drove people to vote to leave the European Union.
So before we leave the subject, I would like to, and I think the audience would also like to gain the benefit of your own perspective, or at least your country's perspective, on this tightening of immigration. You've implied what your position would be, but perhaps you'd like to amplify a little bit the Muslim ban, what's going on in terms of tightening immigration around the world, but particularly what's happening in the United States.
Well, what I will say to you there is that matters of immigration are matters for decision in each country. We have a particular set of policies that we follow in Ireland. Our situation is very different from the countries of mainland Europe, because of geographically,
Sure.
there are borders that can be crossed much more easily. To get to Ireland is more difficult. You have to travel a distance either by sea or by air. And therefore, as an island, we do see the immigration issue somewhat differently. And there is no pressure. There is no political party in Ireland that's campaigning to reduce the number of people from outside the country living in Ireland. And that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. And this allows our government to have a flexible and liberal approach to immigration. We recently, or just this week actually, we changed some of our rules about asylum seekers and so on, and we've agreed to take in some more people. So we are trying to do what we can to take up some of the burden that falls on the countries of the European Union. But this is a very controversial issue right across Europe, and many European governments now are quite resistant to any idea of taking in people from outside the European Union into their countries. There is, of course, free movement within the European Union. In other words, anybody who's a citizen of any one of the 28 member states of the European Union can move, can live and work in any other country and have totally full rights. And that's not caused a problem. That is not an issue. Sure. Most Europeans are quite happy with free movement within the European Union. But there is a resistance, I would have to admit, to movement of people from outside the European Union because the numbers are perceived to be destabilizing to the fabric of certain countries. That's not the case in Ireland because we're not on the front line of immigration from the southern shores of the Mediterranean, as our partners in other parts of Europe definitely are.
That's a superb response, Ambassador, and it speaks well of your country, but it also explains the reality, the objective reality of the position Ireland is in. But the European Union itself is a reflection of the post-World War II liberal world order.
Indeed.
It's kind of the culmination of what we were trying to establish in terms of the West. And that is somewhat being threatened now. But there's also another dimension, isn't there, to the immigration issue? All of my great-grandparents, they grew up in Ireland. They were teachers and in those little ditches behind hedgerows.
Head school teachers, very good.
Yeah. And so...
that's a very noble background to have, Congressman.
Well, thank you. I'm quite proud of it. But the Morans and the Dowds, they came over here in that late 19th century exodus from Ireland. They were seen as, famine-stricken, disease-ridden, crime-breeding immigrants who were seen as expendable, were not welcomed, particularly, but were certainly used within the economy. Now, the Irish don't have any problems anymore about discrimination, but there is another dimension, isn't there, in terms of the way in which the political leaders within governments use the immigration issue. And there is an element of bigotry, of divisiveness toward immigrants. And you don't necessarily, because you're an ambassador, you don't necessarily have to get into this, but it clearly is an issue within our body politic, and I think it is within Europe's as well. This bias against immigrants as though they are a threat to...
Could I just say something about that? Following on from my involvement with the Robert Kennedy 50th anniversary commemoration, I just today wrote a blog about Kennedy, and in that blog I quote extensively from a speech he gave in Scranton, Pennsylvania, on St. Patrick's Day in 1964 to the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, a distinguished organization of Irish people at that time. And in that speech, Kennedy said the following, and I'm summarizing now briefly what was a long speech. He said, "We Irish, we know what discrimination is all about. We were discriminated," he said, "when we came to America, we were subjected to every discrimination that was known to the world at that time, and we had to come through that." And then he said, the lesson from that is that we ought to be on the side of those who are suffering different forms of discrimination in our day. That was in 1964. And he was talking, of course, about racial discrimination in the United States at that time. And he was also talking about, he then talked about the Vietnam War and said that the Irish understood the desire for freedom and that therefore the Irish had an instinctive understanding of those in countries around the world who were under colonial domination. And basically, he argued that the Irish, because of their own history, ought to be on the side of progressive forces in America in the 1960s. I presume he might say the same thing today.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was beautifully done, wasn't it? Huh? That deserves applause. Yeah, so well done. And that's what I was hoping to elicit, and thank you for sharing it. President Trump is also suggesting that the United States has been greatly damaged by our existing international trade agreements, including with our European allies. We have a very strong trade relationship with Ireland today. How might it be affected by the proposed tariffs on the European Union that apparently are going to go beyond steel and aluminum and the like?
Well, the trade relationship between the European Union and the United States benefits both sides of the Atlantic. The idea that the United States is being put upon, look around the United States, it doesn't look like a country that's being reduced to ruin as a result of bad trade agreements. I took part in a video which is, you'll find on YouTube somewhere, the 28 European ambassadors recorded a video in which each one of us gave a sentence about the relationship. And in that video, we clearly make the point that the relationship between the United States and the European Union is one of mutual benefit. And if we go down the road of escalating tariffs applied by one side and the other, that is a road to ruin. And it's ruin for both the United States and the European Union. Trade wars are good for nobody. They only do one thing. They reduce trade and they create economic hardship. And that hardship will be spread all over the place. So there's no way in which the current trend towards tariffs is anything other than a cul-de-sac, a dead end. And therefore, we are of the view that there needs to be a negotiation between the United States and the European Union designed to create freer trade between the United States and the European Union. Yeah. Because we agree that tariffs should be reduced, but we have to do that in a negotiated framework and not by slapping tariffs on each other back and forth. So we would be appealing for restraint, but inevitably the tariffs on steel and aluminum resulted in tariffs on other goods from Europe coming into Europe from the United States. And now that there's talk about tariffs on automobiles, that would also give rise to action on the part of the European Union against American goods. And very soon, you're into a tit-for-tat scenario, which can do nobody any good. It's particularly damaging and dangerous for a country like Ireland.
Very well put. Thank you, Ambassador. So you have mentioned that there are about 700 American firms in Ireland employing about 150,000 Irish citizens, about 7% of your workforce. And Irish firms here in the U.S. are employing about 100,000 U.S. citizens. Now, with Britain leaving the EU, that leaves Ireland as really the only English-speaking country within the EU. So wouldn't that, let me ask that, not prompting the answer, but might that provide an opportunity for Ireland to substantially increase its economic trade?
Indeed. Overall, Brexit's a bad thing for Ireland because we're losing a close ally around the negotiating table in Brussels, on which because we see eye to eye with the British on a lot of issues. I mean, you might think we're on the different sides of the table all the time, but no. In European Union discussions, Ireland and the UK tend to be on the same side most of the time. There are a few exceptions like agriculture where they have a very different view from ours, but for the most part, they're a strong country who have a similar set of interests to the ones that we have, and therefore we'll miss them around the table. We also, of course, will have to deal with the complications that will arise in Northern Ireland with North-South relations and the possibility of our trade with the UK being damaged. All of these things are deeply unwelcome. There is an upside, of course. There's always an upside to things. And the upside to Brexit is that you correctly say that Ireland will, after next year, be the only English-speaking country in the European Union. So next year and the year after, or even this year, preparing for Brexit, an American company that's looking at Europe and looking for a location within the European Union for its business is probably less likely to choose Britain than they would have been 3 years ago, and more likely to choose Ireland. Now, of course, they won't all decide to come to Ireland, but I think a certain number will. And therefore, we will benefit in terms of being able to attract increasing amounts of US investment into Ireland. And that, in turn, will boost the Irish economy and enable our companies to invest more in the United States. So it's a two-way benefit stream. The other potential upside is that after Brexit, Ireland will be the country in the European Union with the closest relationship with the United States, with the best understanding of the United States. And I believe that we have a capacity to play a role as a bridge between the European Union and the United States. And sadly, that bridge role looks like it will be required because there are so many disagreements at the moment, not just the trade and tariffs issue, but also the Iran agreement, which, of course, on which the United States and the European Union disagree also. So I think we will never replace Britain because Britain is a big country, 60 million people. We've got 5 million. We can't possibly replace them. But we can, I think, play an enhanced role in that transatlantic space between the United States and the European Union as a committed EU member, but a country with a long and strong relationship with the United States.
Excellent. So, Ambassador, Michael Collins's vision, as you know, and that of Irish nationalists in Northern Ireland, was to have one undivided Ireland, a unified island. What are the prospects now for that dream to be realized, given Brexit, given the fact that the majority of Northern Irish wanted to stay within the EU?
The issue of United Ireland was dealt with in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. What the Good Friday Agreement says is that the current constitutional arrangements will apply until a majority of people in Northern Ireland wishes to change those arrangements. And if that happens, then the British government and the Irish government will facilitate the unification of Ireland. There is a procedure in the Good Friday Agreement for the British minister responsible for Northern Ireland to call a referendum when that minister believes that there is evidence that there could be a majority in Northern Ireland in favour of a united Ireland. That evidence is not there at the moment. When it will come and in what context and how Brexit might affect thinking in Northern Ireland is still unclear. There are some polls recently suggesting a rising support in Northern Ireland for a united Ireland, but the view of our government, the view of the Irish government, is that this is not the time for a border poll, because the situation created by Brexit is complex enough on its own without adding an additional layer of complexity. If you threw the United Ireland issue into the mix, it would simply stir up difficulties and wouldn't really help to resolve the Brexit conundrum. So our strategy is to deal with Brexit first, to get through Brexit without damaging the North-South relationship, without undermining the peace process, and allow the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement to take effect when the time comes.
Well put. Thank you, Ambassador. So as Stephanie Fassler alluded to, and you amplified, Ambassador, we've seen some unprecedented cultural changes occur in Ireland in recent years with regard to the rights of women and gay people and ethnic diversity, exemplified perhaps by the Taoiseach himself. These are changes that never could have been imagined in a conservative Catholic country a generation ago. Could you share with us not just why so much progressivism is happening in Ireland, but perhaps also contrasting that cultural progress in Ireland with a reactionary, nativist, authoritarian political trend that seems to be occurring in many other European countries today? And that'll be my last question.
That's a fascinating question, and I'm not sure I have the answer, but I will make an effort to provide one, which may not be entirely satisfactory, but nonetheless, I'll give it a go. These changes in Ireland have been underway for quite a long time, but of course, the visible manifestations of these changes have come about in recent times. And the three most obvious ones are the referendum of 2015 on marriage equality, the referendum last month on abortion, and the election of our new Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, who is gay and half Indian. So he is someone from a very different background from the traditional, typical Irish background that you might normally think of. He's also, of course, represents a new generation, because he's 39 years of age. His predecessor, who was wonderful as well, Enda Kenny was, I think, is 68 or something like that. So, it's a total generational change. Our finance minister is 45. His predecessor was 74. And our foreign minister is 45 as well. So, we have a new generation of people at the top in Ireland. And these are people, of course, who grew up in a very different Ireland from the one I grew up in and from the one that their predecessors in political office grew up in. So I think if I had to trace the origins of this change in Ireland, I'm not being narcissistic here, I hope, but I would put it down to a decision made in 1967, which affected me and my generation hugely. And that was a decision by the then education minister to declare that high school education from then on would be free. And what that meant is that it greatly increased the cohort of Irish people who entered high school and finished high school. And of course, 5 years later, when I was ready to graduate from high school, many, many more people went to university. And I can remember arriving in University College Cork in late September 1972, and just entering a world where almost everyone there, I reckon that day, was the first member of their family ever to go to university. There obviously were some exceptions, but I was the first member of my family ever to go to university. And I reckon that many of those people that I met in those early days and years at university were people in the very same situation. So an educational revolution. And that, I think, over time has had the effect of transforming attitudes in Ireland. And today, for example, about 60% of Irish people between 18 and 25 are in third level education. And in the kind of 25 to 35, 25 to 45 age group, 50% of that population has a third level degree. So it's not difficult to imagine that that kind of educational revolution occurring over a 40-year period would transform attitudes and make people think differently about the world around them. I also think that the things that were exposed over the last 20 years, the various, the Magdalene laundries where women who were pregnant were held in kind of conditions of semi-captivity and treated very badly. The mother and baby homes. There was a whole raft of really quite shocking things that happened. And it wasn't only in Ireland, by the way. Things happened in other countries as well. I mean, gosh, every country has to own up to terrible things that happened in the past that we now regard as unacceptable, but at the time were seen as somewhat normal. So all of those things, I think, also have woken people up, and there seems to be a commitment now in Ireland to transcending those past travesties and building a more open and tolerant Ireland. And that is why I think the results of those referendums were so conclusive. I mean, remember, the referendum on marriage equality, I mean, the vote was like 62 to 38. I mean, it passed in every single area, including rural areas, where people thought they'll never vote for this there. But they did. There was only, out of 32 constituencies, only one voted no. And that was by about 100 votes, so it was a very narrow no vote. On this occasion, the vote was even higher. It was 66% to 34. And apart from one constituency again, every part of the country voted to remove the Eighth Amendment and to provide, to allow the government to legislate for abortion. And it's, I can only attribute that to a desire on the part of Irish people to create a more open, tolerant, caring society. And this is probably part of that legacy that Robert Kennedy spoke about when he addressed the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick in 1964.
Profound, transformative changes. The answers, when the ambassador articulates them, seem quite obvious, but never really quite so well articulated as you have done so. Thank you, Ambassador. There's one little thing I want to mention. I guess we'll open it up for a few minutes, but there's an interesting little story. You mentioned the Taoiseach. The Taoiseach came over here. He made a special trip to the Choctaw Nation.
He did.
Maybe you could just give us a little background on why the Taoiseach of Ireland would visit the Choctaw Indian Nation.
Well, first of all, Taoiseach in Gaelic means chief, so maybe that was the reason. But no, the reason was that in 1847, the worst year of the Irish famine, and this was just after the Trail of Tears, when the Native Indian groups were driven out of their homelands and driven further west, and many of them endured dreadful suffering, and there were many deaths and great deprivation. But the Choctaw Nation heard about the Irish famine, and there was a fund established in New York to send money back to Ireland to relieve the famine distress. And the Choctaw Nation contributed $170, which was a fairly substantial sum of money in those days. And that gift has been remembered in Ireland ever since. So the Taoiseach, on his first visit to America as Taoiseach for St. Patrick's Day, decided he wanted to go down and personally thank the Choctaw Nation for their generosity all those years ago.
Thank you. Thanks for that explanation. It's interesting background. If people would have a question, they could go to the microphone. We have another 15 to 20 minutes at the most. We don't want to take up all your evening, but this has been very substantive. Obviously, the ambassador has a good deal of knowledge and insight, wisdom to share. Sir, would you like to have the first question?
Sure. So you talked a lot about trade, and in the United States, a lot of this anger over trade and the feeling that people have been taken advantage of is driven by large levels of economic inequality. Economic inequality that in the past 35 to 40 years has increased in most of the developed world, but in the United States to levels much higher than that of the rest of Europe. So my question is, from a European and Irish perspective, what can the U.S. learn about ensuring that those left behind by this great economic growth are able to enjoy the benefits of the rest of the economy and improve their general standard of living with respect to things like education that you've talked about?
Well, each country, of course, has to decide on its own internal arrangements as to how what it prioritizes when it comes to how much it taxes on the one hand, and then what it spends, the revenue that the government accumulates, what it spends that money on. In Europe and in Ireland, it's the same case. We would have a fairly strong social safety net. So, in other words, our welfare payments are fairly. I won't say substantial because the amounts are obviously not huge, but probably by other standards, we spend a reasonable amount on social welfare. Payments to people who are unemployed, payments to people who have disabilities, payments to people who are retired and don't have occupational pensions. So that's the European model. Other European countries actually spend. We're relatively lightly taxed. About our government spends about 35% of GDP on government services. The figure for some European countries is closer to 50 because some of them have more comprehensive social systems and in particular have more public provision of healthcare. In Ireland we have a national health service, but it's a mixed system where many people have private insurance, but also if you if you don't have private insurance, you do get care, and especially if you have an income under a certain level, care is provided. It's also provided for people over 70. So we do have a system that does. Our tax system is, I think, quite progressive in that a lot of people don't pay any tax but then once you start paying tax, you go up into the higher brackets pretty quickly. So there are many people in Ireland now who would criticize our system and say we're not generous enough, we're far. But I think compared with America, the European system, including the Irish system, is based on a very different set of premises. As I understand it, the American system is one where the belief system indicates that you want smaller government, lower taxes, and therefore you don't insist on the same level of services that would be regarded as normal in a European country.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, sir.
Ambassador, thank you.
Incidentally,
Remarks.
we really have more people lined up than we anticipated or that we're going to have time for. So we could either cut short the line or ask everyone to give kind of a short question
to answer
or
all
a
the
question
questions,
that
yeah.
will elicit a short answer.
Yeah, okay.
I just,
Do that very easily.
And I'll give short answers. I
no,
promise.
you're excellent. They're here to listen to you, but yes, sir.
I'm looking forward to a short answer to this question. I noted the appointment of Drew Harris this morning as Commissioner of the Garter in Phoenix Park. Of course, that begs the question of whether people in Dublin and in Belfast these days are worried about a reanimation of the paramilitaries, which have been somewhat fading over the last 10 years.
No, I don't think that's the reason why Drew Harris was appointed. Just for information, our police commissioner, it's called the Garda Commissioner, a new Garda Commissioner was appointed today, and he is a policeman from Northern Ireland. So we've gone outside the state to seek a police commissioner for our police force. I think he was appointed because there have been a few problems with our police. Probably on international scale, those problems might not be seen as momentous, but there have been problems, and I think there's a feeling that an outside person that is not part of the current police service or would be an asset. So it's nothing to do with a potential threat of renewed paramilitarism. It's got much more to do with a desire on the part of the Irish government to shake up our police force and to bring in an outside person to try and ensure that the reforms that are perceived to be necessary actually take place.
It's a good question. It's one that I would have thought to ask. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm a graduate of Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri, where Churchill gave the Iron Curtain speech in 1946. To what extent do you think the attack on liberal democracies will succeed? And if so, who benefits and who's orchestrating it?
Well, I think it's incumbent on all of us to continue to make the case for liberal democracy. I don't see any alternative system that is going to serve the world and our societies better than liberal democracy for all of its failings. Of course it has failings, but if you think about the European Union, for example, and the political culture of Europe has delivered 70 plus years of peace to a continent that had never known that amount of peace in its entire history, and a period of significant prosperity. Unfortunately, there's an unsettled atmosphere around at the moment, and a lot of it is clearly got to do with the recession of the Great Recession of 10 years ago, and the fact that the recovery from that recession is perceived to be a bit uneven, and that not everyone believes that they have gained the same benefit as others have gained. And I think this is creating this kind of anxiety, which is being exploited by some movements in order to reinforce their own support base.
Thank you for raising the issue, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, Jack Warner, Climate Institute. It's not a climate change question, though. It's on the economy. Can you talk a little bit about the incentives that were put in place and the success that has happened for being able to reverse the migration from rural areas to urban areas and getting people back into the rural areas working?
Well, of course, the Irish economy has been transformed over a period of 60 years since the late 50s when we first started bringing in foreign direct investment. We provided a lot of incentives for companies to come in the early days. Now we're not allowed to do that anymore because under European law, we are restricted in what we can offer to companies, so that's much more limited. What we do offer is a highly educated workforce, a young workforce. Ireland's got one of the youngest populations in Europe. We offer a government that's constructive and supportive of business, and we offer, of course, a 12.5% flat corporation tax. That's not the first reason why companies come to Ireland, but it's certainly part of the package of benefits that they acquire by being in Ireland. I would say that the balance between urban and rural is still a little bit of a work in progress. inevitably, most companies who come into Ireland want to be in Dublin, want to be in the greater Dublin area. Cork also has a fairly substantial industrial base, as does Galway and Limerick, Waterford. And it is true, I think, that the rural areas still need to be supported in many ways. Now, the government has a new plan. It's called Ireland 2040. They've committed to investing a substantial amount of money in various aspects of our economic development for the future. And part of that is certainly going to be trying to reverse the slightly unbalanced urban-rural situation that exists at the moment. But that's a work in progress. No country in the world has ever managed to solve the urban-rural issue. And I'm not sure that we'll be able to solve it either, but we have to make an effort to ensure that people can be facilitated to live their lives and have livelihoods in rural areas as well as in urban areas. Yes.
Good issue. Thank you. Ambassador, yes, sir.
Yes. Hi, my name is Patrick Realisa. I'm a member of the World Affairs Council here in D.C. Earlier this evening, you alluded to the importance of education in Ireland and that paving the way for young, ambitious people to kind of be in political office or be successful. As you know, President Trump recently made the announcement to merge the Department of Education and Labor here in the United States as an effort to better provide opportunities and so forth. Can you provide some thoughts on that?
Well, we haven't done it. But I mean, I've not really thought about that issue, to be honest with you. Education has been a huge plus for Ireland. I don't know that the man who introduced free high school education back in the 60s really anticipated or understood what he was doing, but actually he was transforming our country in a fundamental way. And if I had to encourage any form of investment in a country's future, I would encourage investment in education, because I don't see any other investment likely to produce results on a long-term basis. Remember, education is not a short-term panacea. If you're looking for a short-term solution, education won't do it for you. But if you're looking for generational change, if you're looking for improvements in your economy over a decade and more, education is the best investment you can make.
Amen. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder, in the United States compared to the Ireland or whatever you can contribute, I just wonder what Americans should change. Because now I know all the younger generation, they are unhappy about the system. The government is not doing right, and their family are just going sort of no better solution for them. So they sort of want to, in a sense, want to rebellion, have their own decision. They say they don't have to listen to their parents anymore. So do you think this has something to do with education, that you should build in with some moral value or education or ethical value in there? So exactly what Ireland you can do that the Americans should follow?
Well, every country has to figure out its own destiny. There's no blueprint for success that works in every country in the world. And I'm very conscious that the United States is such a different country from Ireland. I mean, many of the American states are larger than Ireland, have larger populations than we have. So I do think that we need to be respectful of that fact, and trying to draw conclusions from Ireland's experience and apply them to the United States would not be, in my view, a very productive thing to try to do. But I do think that Ireland is an interesting case study, because it's an English-speaking country, therefore familiar to Americans, and yet it does things differently. So maybe there is something that can be learned from the Irish experience. And I'd also like Ireland to start looking at a number of American states which are equivalent to us in population. No point in looking at California or Texas. They're much too big. We can never compare ourselves with those, or New York, again. But smaller states, I think, it'd be interesting to see. Actually, I'm planning next year to actually do a project whereby we look at all 50 states one by one and try to figure out where are the opportunities for Ireland to connect with those states into the future. What can we learn from them, and what might they be able to learn from us? We also now happily have a lot of educational exchanges. Every Irish university has multiple connections with American universities, and American students go to Ireland in large numbers. I hope that will become a productive learning experience for those young Americans. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Pascal Sigo. I am a geopolitical consultant. I would like to come back to Brexit. Are you or is your government aware of any technical solution that can ensure no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland and satisfy the UK's desire to not be in the single market or the customs union?
That's an extremely good question. The short answer is no.
Okay.
Now, the British government have promised to come up with some proposals, and who knows, maybe they have some scheme that will work.
Wand?
But we're skeptical, and we don't believe that you can have a technological solution to this problem. But we have to wait and see what the British government comes up with by way of proposals. We think that some kind of alignment, which is what's been promised. I mean, what's been promised in the conclusions of the European Council from December is that the British government will ensure that there is no divergence between the regulatory framework in Northern Ireland and the one in Ireland. And how they achieve that is really an issue for them to have to grapple with. And so far, they haven't come up with a solution to that problem. I really hope they do, because we need a solution. We don't want to see these negotiations run aground and fail, because that would be a recipe for a disruptive period in relations between the European Union and the UK, which would not be good for anyone, including for Ireland.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
But it's fair to say they created the problem. It's up to them to fix it, to solve it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So Ireland is generally favorable towards international institutions, with the EU and the UN. When it comes to security cooperation, Ireland is kind of notably not part of NATO. So in your opinion, or Ireland's perspective overall, will Ireland ever seek to join NATO or any other similar institutions?
I don't believe we'll ever join NATO, but we're not absent from the security field. Last week, we celebrated 60 years of Irish involvement in UN peacekeeping. And during that time, we've had 70,000 tours of duty by Irish police and military in UN peacekeeping operations all over the world. And those tours of duty could be 6 months or more. So, and currently, in the Mediterranean, for the last couple of years, there's been an Irish naval vessel out there rescuing people from stranded boats in the Mediterranean. They've saved thousands of people's lives already. So we're very active in our desire to contribute to global security. But we feel we can best make that contribution through peacekeeping rather than through membership of a military alliance. We have recently joined the new European security cooperation process called PESCO, and we will obviously have to look at how we can best contribute to European security cooperation in the future. There is, of course, a debate in Europe about the future of European security and defence. Ireland will be part of that debate. The debate is still in its infancy, and I think we will have to find a way of making our contribution in the best possible manner. And that would probably be through the skills we've developed in peacekeeping. Ireland has a record second to none in the peacekeeping field. We now train peacekeepers in Ireland for operations around the world. And that's the kind of area where I think we will want to continue to play a role in support of international peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Good question. Well, it's now 8 o'clock. The session is concluded. I think we have all tremendously benefited by having the ambassador share his views, his insights, his knowledge with us. Thomas Cahill wrote a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. No, I'm sure you did. It may be time for the Irish once again to save civilization. And if they
called
do,
upon, we shall do our best.
Well, if and when it happens, I know you will lead that effort, Ambassador. You've been wonderful. It was just an extraordinary presentation. Stephanie, did you have anything to add as our Executive Director for the World Affairs Council?
Vice President of Operations. Don't put me too high.
It's close enough.
But I'd just like to thank both Ambassador Mulhall and Congressman Moran for sharing their time with us today. Please join me in thanking them.